The mournful melody drifted through the cemetery fog, haunting and impossible. Harold paused, shovel mid-dig, certain his ears deceived him. 20 years as Oakridge Cemetery's gravedigger had taught him the dead stayed silent. Yet there it was, violin notes rising from plot 237, buried last week. A musician's grave. Harold approached cautiously, the music growing clearer with each step. Something inside him knew he shouldn't investigate, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. The fresh dirt had been disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out. Don't miss what Harold discovers next. Subscribe now for the chilling continuation. Harold Winters had been Oakridge Cemetery's gravedigger since his early 20s, inheriting the position from his father. At 47, his weathered hands bore calluses like badges of honor, his back permanently stooped from decades of digging. The cemetery was more home to him than his small, empty apartment on the edge of town. What few people knew was that Harold carried a grief as heavy as the caskets he lowered into the ground. 15 years ago, his wife and daughter had perished in a house fire while he worked the night shift. He'd arrived home to find his world reduced to ashes, his family beyond saving. Since then, Harold had retreated into solitude, finding strange comfort among the dead who couldn't leave him as suddenly as the living had. His simple goal each day was to maintain dignity for those in his care. Harold took pride in perfectly rectangular graves and immaculate grounds. He spoke softly to the departed as he worked, believing someone should acknowledge their passing with respect. The town, however, viewed him differently. Children called him Grave Harold or the Ghoul when they spotted him in the grocery store. Adults weren't much better, falling silent when he entered the local diner, their discomfort palpable. Dr. Lawrence Mercer, the town's prominent physician and cemetery board chairman, was the worst. The doctor had made it his mission to modernize cemetery operations, repeatedly suggesting Harold's methods were outdated and that younger staff could manage the grounds more efficiently. Just last month, during the board's public meeting, Mercer had humiliated him. Mr. Winters' reluctance to embrace technology and proper record-keeping is concerning, Mercer had announced to the gathered crowd. His unusual attachment to the deceased borders on the inappropriate. Perhaps it's time we considered whether Oakridge deserves more professional management. The room had fallen silent, all eyes on Harold. His reputation, already fragile, cracked further under the weight of Mercer's implications. Harold had simply nodded, unable to defend himself against the whispers that followed. Now, standing before plot 237 with violin music inexplicably rising from the grave, Harold faced a choice. Investigating could confirm Mercer's accusations of his instability. Ignoring it might mean abandoning someone, or something, that needed him. The music grew louder as Harold knelt beside the grave, his fingers trembling as they brushed away loose soil. The violin's melody was haunting yet precise, no recording or distant radio. It emanated directly from beneath the earth. Harold glanced over his shoulder, ensuring he was alone before continuing his investigation. The following morning, Dr. Mercer's luxury sedan rolled up the cemetery's gravel path, stopping where Harold was trimming around a headstone. Mercer stepped out, his polished shoes gleaming in stark contrast to Harold's mud-caked boots. "Mr. Winters," Mercer called, his voice carrying the artificial warmth he reserved for public appearances. "Mrs. Ellison reported seeing flashlights in the cemetery last night. Care to explain?" Harold straightened slowly, his back protesting. "Just routine checks, doctor. Thought I heard something unusual." Mercer's smile tightened. "Unusual? Like what, precisely? Ghosts? Zombies?" He chuckled, making a show of it for his driver who remained by the car. "This isn't helping your case, Harold. The board specifically discussed your after-hours activities last meeting." "I'm just doing my job," Harold replied quietly. "Your job is to dig holes and fill them, not conduct midnight investigations." Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "One more incident like this, and I'll have cause to expedite your replacement." 2 days later, Harold found himself summoned to an emergency board meeting. He sat alone on one side of the conference table while Mercer and 5 board members faced him from the other. A small digital recorder sat between them. "We've received concerning information," Mercer began, pressing play on the device. Harold's voice emerged from the speaker. "I know you're down there. I can hear your music. I'll help you if I can." The recording continued with the sound of Harold digging, muttering to himself about helping the trapped musician. Mercer stopped the playback, his expression grave but eyes gleaming with triumph. "Mrs. Ellison recorded this from her property adjacent to the cemetery. She was quite disturbed. Harold's face burned with humiliation. "I can explain. Talking to corpses, Harold. Digging up fresh graves." Mercer shook his head. "We've tolerated your eccentricities out of respect for your years of service, but this crosses a line." There was music coming from the grave, Harold insisted, immediately regretting his words as eyebrows raised around the table. "I think we've heard enough," said one board member, avoiding Harold's gaze. The final confrontation came a week later during the prestigious Founders' Day ceremony held at the cemetery. The town's elite gathered around the Founders' Monument while Harold remained at a distance, instructed to stay out of sight but available if needed. Midway through Mercer's speech, the doctor paused dramatically. "And while we honor our past, we must also embrace progress. Which is why I'm pleased to announce Oakridge Cemetery's modernization initiative." Mercer gestured toward Harold. "Our longtime gravedigger, Harold Winters, will be transitioning to a consulting role as we welcome a professional grounds management team." The crowd applauded while Harold stood frozen, publicly stripped of his position without warning. Several people glanced his way with pitying expressions. "Harold," Mercer continued, "why don't you join us? After all, this transition concerns you most directly." Reluctantly, Harold approached the gathering. As he passed the freshly decorated graves, he noticed something peculiar, a small violin case partially visible beneath flowers at plot 237. No one else seemed to notice it. What the townspeople didn't know, what even Mercer couldn't suspect, was that before becoming a gravedigger, Harold had studied forensic archaeology at university. His quiet demeanor and isolated lifestyle had obscured his methodical mind and scientific training. As he stared at the violin case, Harold's dormant investigative instincts awakened. Whatever mystery lay buried in plot 237, he now possessed both the motivation and skills to uncover it. From the shadows of a marble mausoleum, Judge Eleanor Blackwood observed the ceremony. Her eyes narrowed at Mercer's announcement. She tapped her cane once against the stone path, making a note in her small leather journal before slipping away unnoticed. Harold waited until nightfall before returning to the cemetery. The Founders' Day ceremony had left him with a bitter taste in his mouth, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. As he slipped through the wrought iron gates using his master key, one that Mercer hadn't yet thought to reclaim, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The moon hung low and full, casting long shadows across the tombstones. Harold moved with practiced ease through the familiar grounds, his footsteps silent on the dewy grass. He carried a small backpack containing tools he hadn't used in years, a digital camera, measuring tape, pH testing strips, sample containers, and a notebook. When he reached plot 237, Harold paused. The flowers from the ceremony had been disturbed, and the violin case was no longer visible. He knelt beside the grave, running his fingers over the freshly turned soil. Forensic archaeology isn't just about digging, he whispered to himself, recalling his professor's words. It's about reading the story written in the earth. Harold began his methodical examination, first photographing the grave site from multiple angles. He noted the unusual settling pattern of the soil, inconsistent with a standard burial. Next, he collected soil samples from various depths, carefully labeling each one. As he worked, Harold's mind cleared. The years of isolation melted away, replaced by the precise, analytical thinking that had once earned him academic recognition. He measured the dimensions of the disturbed area, noting that it was narrower than standard protocol required. Mercer cut corners, Harold muttered, making detailed notes. The grave is too shallow by at least 18 inches. He continued his investigation, moving with increasing confidence. Harold extracted core samples from the surrounding area, comparing soil composition and noting anomalies. The scientific process felt like reuniting with an old friend, familiar, comforting, and empowering. 3 hours into his work, Harold made a discovery that sent a chill down his spine. The pH levels in the soil directly above where the casket would be were significantly different from the surrounding area. This particular chemical signature was consistent with preservatives used in high-end musical instruments, specifically, those used for violins. Someone buried something valuable with this body, he concluded, or instead of it. Harold was so absorbed in his work that he almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. He quickly gathered his equipment and ducked behind a nearby mausoleum. Through the darkness, he recognized Dr. Mercer's silhouette, accompanied by 2 men he didn't recognize. "The board is getting nervous," one of the men said. "If anyone starts asking questions about these special arrangements." "No one will," Mercer interrupted. The old gravedigger is the only one who might have noticed anything unusual, and he's been thoroughly discredited. Everyone thinks he's lost his mind. Harold remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing as Mercer and his companion stopped near plot 237. "How many more do you need?" asked the second man. "3, maybe 4, Mercer replied. "The buyers are willing to pay premium rates, especially for the antique instruments. The last Stradivarius fetched over 2 million. Harold's eyes widened. The pieces were beginning to fit together, the music he'd heard, the violin case, the unusual soil composition. Mercer wasn't just cutting corners on burials, he was involved in something far more sinister. "And the bodies?" the first man asked. "Cremated privately," Mercer said dismissively. "The families sign off on everything. They think they're getting a traditional burial, but the paperwork gives us flexibility in the final disposition of remains. It's all perfectly legal, if creatively interpreted." Harold carefully removed his camera from his bag and, using the night vision setting, took several photographs of the men. As they continued their conversation, he recorded their voices using his phone. When the men finally left, Harold remained hidden for another 20 minutes, ensuring they were truly gone. His heart raced with a mixture of vindication and horror. Mercer had been using his position to orchestrate an elaborate scheme, substituting valuable musical instruments for bodies in certain graves, cremating the remains instead, and presumably selling the instruments on the black market. The next morning, Harold sat in his small kitchen, organizing his evidence. He had soil samples, photographs, audio recordings, and detailed notes. But he knew that going directly to the local police might be risky. Mercer was well connected in the community, and Harold's recent reputation as a disturbed old man wouldn't help his credibility. A knock at his door startled him. Harold quickly covered his materials with a newspaper before answering. Judge Eleanor Blackwood stood on his porch, leaning slightly on her cane. "Mr. Winters," she said, her voice crisp. "May I come in?" Harold hesitated before stepping aside. Judge Blackwood had always been a formidable presence in town, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering integrity. She had retired from the bench 5 years ago but still commanded respect. "I observed yesterday's ceremony," she said, settling into a chair at his kitchen table. Dr. Mercer's announcement seemed rather abrupt. Harold remained standing, uncertain of her purpose. "Judge Blackwood, Eleanor, please," she corrected. "I'm no longer on the bench." Her eyes drifted to the corner of a photograph peeking out from beneath the newspaper. "Though once a judge, always a judge, in some ways. We develop an eye for details others miss." With deliberate movements, she pulled the newspaper aside, revealing Harold's organized evidence. "I see you've been busy," she remarked, examining a soil sample label. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Harold said cautiously. "Try me," Eleanor replied. "I've spent 40 years listening to people's stories and determining their veracity. And I've had my suspicions about Mercer for some time." Harold hesitated only briefly before explaining everything: the music from the grave, his discovery of the violin case, and finally, the conversation he'd overheard last night. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When he finished, she nodded once. "Forensic archaeology, you said? Interesting background for a gravedigger." "Life takes unexpected turns," Harold replied. "Indeed it does." Eleanor tapped her cane thoughtfully against the floor. "Mr. Winters, I believe you've uncovered something significant. But Mercer has powerful friends, and your approach must be strategic." She reached into her handbag and removed a business card, sliding it across the table. "My former clerk is now with the State Attorney General's office. Special Investigations Division." She wrote a note on the back of the card. "Call this number directly. Mention my name and the code I've written here. They'll take your evidence seriously." Harold stared at the card. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor's eyes hardened. "Because justice matters, Mr. Winters. Even for those who can no longer speak for themselves." She rose to her feet. "I suggest you make copies of everything and store them in separate locations. And perhaps stay with a friend for a few days." As she moved toward the door, she added, "I'll be making some calls of my own. Mercer won't find it so easy to dismiss your claims when they come through official channels." After she left, Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a discredited gravedigger anymore, he was an investigator with specialized knowledge, evidence, and now, an ally with influence. He carefully packed his evidence, made the call to the Attorney General's office, and prepared to reclaim not just his reputation, but his responsibility to those he had buried with such care over the years. As the sun set that evening, Harold looked out his window toward the cemetery on the hill. For the first time in weeks, he didn't hear the mysterious violin music. But he knew the truth now, and soon, others would hear it too. What did you think of Harold's investigation? I'd love to know where you're watching this story from. Comment below and let me know what part of the world you're enjoying this mystery from. The next morning, Harold found his apartment door ajar. Inside, everything was ransacked, but only his evidence was missing. On his kitchen table lay a single violin string coiled into a noose, alongside a newspaper clipping about his wife's accident 3 years ago. Harold's hands trembled as he stared at the violin string coiled into a noose. The message couldn't be clearer. They knew he was investigating, and they were threatening him with the same fate as his wife. The newspaper clipping about her accident confirmed his long-held suspicions that her death had never been an accident at all. He grabbed his phone and dialed Eleanor's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Next, he tried the number for the state attorney general's office, but the line was busy. Panic rising in his chest, Harold gathered what little evidence remained, photographs he'd stored on his phone and notes he'd kept in his jacket pocket, and fled his apartment. The cemetery loomed on the hill like a silent sentinel as Harold drove past it toward the county courthouse. He needed to speak with someone in authority immediately, before Mercer could cover his tracks completely. As he parked his car, he noticed a black sedan pulling in behind him, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Harold hurried up the courthouse steps, glancing over his shoulder. 2 men in dark suits emerged from the sedan, their purposeful strides leaving no doubt they were following him. He quickened his pace, pushing through the heavy doors into the marble-floored lobby. The security checkpoint slowed him down. As he emptied his pockets into the plastic tray, he saw the men enter the building. Harold rushed through the metal detector, grabbing his belongings without organizing them, and headed for the elevator. "Hold the door," he called to a woman stepping into the elevator. She obliged, and Harold slipped inside just as the 2 men cleared security. The doors closed on their approaching figures. "Which floor?" the woman asked. "4th, please." "State attorney's office," Harold replied, trying to steady his breathing. "That's where I'm headed to," she said, studying him. "Are you all right, sir?" Harold recognized her then, the assistant he'd spoken with on the phone yesterday. "I'm Harold Winters. I called about the cemetery investigation," she finished, lowering her voice. "We've been expecting you, but not like this. What happened?" By the time they reached the 4th floor, Harold had given her a rushed explanation. She led him through a maze of corridors to a conference room where, to his surprise, Eleanor was already seated alongside 2 official-looking men. "Mr. Winters," Eleanor nodded. "I was just briefing Agent Donovan and District Attorney Pearson on what you shared with me. Someone broke into my apartment," Harold blurted out. "They took everything, all my evidence. And they left this." He placed the violin string on the table. Agent Donovan leaned forward. "And you believe this is connected to your wife's death?" "I know it is," Harold said firmly. "The same people who killed her are behind the body-switching scheme at Mercer's funeral home." For the next hour, Harold recounted everything again, showing the photos on his phone and the soil samples he'd managed to save. D.A. Pearson looked skeptical, but Agent Donovan seemed increasingly interested. "We need more concrete evidence," Pearson finally said. "These soil samples and your testimony aren't enough for a warrant." "Then let me get you more," Harold insisted. "Tonight is Thursday, Mercer's night for moving bodies according to what I overheard. If we set up surveillance." "Too risky without proper authorization," Pearson interrupted. Eleanor tapped her cane against the floor. "Perhaps there's another approach. Mr. Winters still has access to the cemetery grounds, does he not?" All eyes turned to Harold. "Yes, technically I'm still employed there." "Then perhaps," Eleanor continued, "a legitimate exhumation could be arranged. One that wouldn't require a warrant since it would be part of normal cemetery operations." Agent Donovan's eyes lit up. "The Harrington plot. They're scheduled to be moved to the family mausoleum next week anyway." "Mercer would never allow it," Harold objected. "He wouldn't have to know," Agent Donovan replied. "Not until we're already there." As darkness fell, Harold found himself back at the cemetery, dressed in his work clothes, operating the backhoe with practiced precision. Agent Donovan and 2 forensic specialists waited nearby in unmarked vehicles, while Eleanor had positioned herself in her car at the cemetery entrance, ostensibly visiting her husband's grave but actually serving as lookout. The plan was simple but dangerous. Harold would exhume the Harrington casket under the guise of preparing for its scheduled relocation. The forensic team would verify if the body inside matched the death certificate. If Mercer had indeed switched bodies as Harold suspected, they would have their evidence. The backhoe's headlights cut through the fog as Harold carefully removed the earth above the Harrington plot. His heart pounded in his chest, every sound amplified in the night air. He kept expecting to hear violin music, but the cemetery remained eerily silent. His radio crackled. "Vehicle approaching the main gate," came Eleanor's steady voice. "Black SUV, moving slowly." "That's Mercer's vehicle," Harold responded, his mouth dry. "He shouldn't be here tonight." "Continue the operation," Agent Donovan instructed through the radio. "We're moving into position." Harold worked faster, the backhoe's mechanical arm lifting away the final layer of soil. The casket was now visible in the excavated grave. He shut down the machine and climbed down, grabbing his shovel to clear the remaining dirt by hand. The radio crackled again. He stopped at the office. Lights just went on inside. Harold had just finished exposing the casket lid when headlights swept across the cemetery grounds. Mercer's SUV was moving again, coming directly toward the Harrington plot. "He's heading your way," Eleanor warned. "Be careful." Agent Donovan's voice came through next. "Winters, get that casket open now. We need to see what's inside before he interferes." Harold worked the latches on the casket, his fingers slipping with sweat despite the cool night air. The SUV was getting closer, its headlights illuminating the fog in eerie patterns. Finally, the last latch gave way, and Harold lifted the heavy lid. What he saw inside made him gasp. The casket contained not a body, but dozens of small packages wrapped in plastic, nestled in where a corpse should have been. "It's drugs," Harold whispered into the radio. "The casket is full of drugs." The SUV screeched to a halt 30 yards away. Its doors flew open, and Mercer emerged, along with the two men who had followed Harold to the courthouse. All three were armed. "Step away from the grave, Winters," Mercer shouted, raising his weapon. Agent Donovan and his team emerged from their hiding places, guns drawn. "Federal agents. Drop your weapons." Harold stood frozen between them, the open casket beside him, as Mercer's cold eyes locked onto his. In that moment, Harold faced the most difficult choice of his life: dive for cover and risk being caught in crossfire, or use himself as a distraction to give the agents a better chance at apprehending the men who had murdered his wife. As the standoff intensified, Harold made his decision. Harold dove to the side, rolling behind a nearby headstone as the first shots rang out. The cemetery erupted into chaos, muzzle flashes illuminating the fog in strobing bursts of light. "You should have stayed out of it, Winters," Mercer shouted, firing wildly in Harold's direction. "Just like your wife should have." The mention of his wife ignited something primal in Harold. The fear that had paralyzed him moments before transformed into cold resolve. He had been right all along, Mercer had killed Sarah. Agent Donovan and his team returned fire, forcing Mercer and his men to scatter for cover among the gravestones. The federal agents moved with practiced precision, calling out positions and slowly tightening their perimeter. One of Mercer's men fell first, crying out as a bullet found its mark. The second man attempted to flee toward the cemetery's eastern gate but was quickly surrounded and forced to surrender. Mercer, however, was more resourceful. Using the confusion, he circled back toward his SUV, firing sporadically to keep the agents pinned down. Harold watched from behind the headstone as Mercer reached the vehicle and yanked open the door. "He's getting away," Harold shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Mercer turned to climb into his SUV, a haunting strain of violin music drifted through the cemetery. The melody was faint but unmistakable, the same tune Harold had heard nights before. Mercer froze, his head whipping toward the sound. His momentary distraction was all Agent Donovan needed. 2 shots rang out, and Mercer collapsed against his vehicle, his gun clattering to the ground. The cemetery fell silent except for the lingering notes of violin music, which faded as mysteriously as they had appeared. In the aftermath, the truth emerged piece by piece. Mercer's funeral home had been the center of a sophisticated drug trafficking operation. The Harrington casket was just one of many used to transport narcotics across state lines. When Sarah Winters had noticed discrepancies in the cemetery records, bodies that didn't match death certificates, graves that were shallower than regulations required, she had unwittingly stumbled onto Mercer's operation. He had her killed to protect himself, Agent Donovan explained to Harold as they stood in the cemetery office 2 days later. We found evidence linking him directly to the hit-and-run. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Harold nodded, but the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but Sarah was still gone. No arrest could bring her back. What about the music? Harold asked. Did you ever figure out where it was coming from? Agent Donovan shook his head. Some things defy explanation, Mr. Winters. Perhaps it was just the wind. But Harold knew better. That night, after the agents had left and the cemetery was quiet once more, he returned to Sarah's grave. He sat beside the headstone, running his fingers over the engraved letters of her name. It was you, wasn't it? He whispered. You were trying to tell me something all along. As if in answer, the faintest strain of violin music drifted through the air, so soft he might have imagined it. But Harold smiled, tears streaming down his face. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only accepted. In the coming weeks, the town would gossip about Mercer's downfall, about the respected funeral director who had built his fortune on death and deception. His reputation was in ruins, his empire dismantled. But for Harold, there was only the quiet certainty that Sarah could finally rest in peace, her killer brought to justice by the very music that had haunted him on those lonely nights among the graves. As the seasons changed, Harold found a new rhythm to his life. The cemetery no longer felt like a place of dread but rather a sanctuary of peace. He continued his work as gravedigger with renewed purpose, ensuring each soul was laid to rest with dignity and care. The investigation had brought unexpected changes. The funeral home, now under new management, operated with transparency. Harold had been offered a promotion to cemetery caretaker, a position he accepted with quiet pride. On quiet evenings, he would visit Sarah's grave, sometimes bringing fresh flowers or simply sitting in contemplative silence. The violin music never returned, but Harold didn't need it anymore. He had found his closure. I think she'd be proud, Agent Donovan remarked during his final visit to tie up loose ends. Not everyone has the courage to stand up to people like Mercer. Harold nodded, watching the sunset paint the headstones in amber light. I'm just glad it's over. But was it truly? 3 months after Mercer's arrest, Harold noticed something peculiar while reviewing the cemetery records. Several plots purchased decades ago under the name Blackwood showed recent activity, maintenance fees paid through an offshore account, fresh flowers appearing despite no recorded visitors. When Harold investigated the oldest Blackwood grave, he discovered a small wooden box tucked behind the headstone. Inside lay a tarnished locket containing a faded photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like Sarah. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed this mysterious tale. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think Harold will discover about the Blackwood family?